everyone. It's great to see so many people here again, and welcome to another evening of great decisions at Manitowoc Public Library. Just wanted, as always, to start our evening before I get to our speaker, to thank our sponsors, the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Friends of Manitowoc Public Library, the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and the University of Wisconsin-Manitowoc. Just wanted to remind you that even though typically we would only have one more great decision week coming up, we have two this time because of the inclement weather when Beth Doherty was supposed to speak. She was able to reschedule, so next week we will be doing global health, progress and challenges, and then the following week we will go back and handle Turkey and our relationship with Turkey, rather than just watching the videotape. So, and Beth is fantastic. I heartily recommend that you come back for the following 2 weeks. So, there's that. Of course, I need to remind you, and I will do it briefly, that if you are able to donate to keep programs like this going, please do. I won't go into it any more than that. There are pamphlets over on the table. You can look at it. There's a variety of different ways to donate to the Public Library Foundation. Also, the Great Decisions book, there are 11 books left. It's a great resource book filled with a lot of information and where to find out more things on every one of the topics we address. They are now on sale. Exactly. So if you waited, good call. $7.50 down at the service desk. That's a great price anywhere. So if you're looking to pick up the Great Decisions book for this year, here it is, and you can get it downstairs. So at this point, normally I bring someone up to introduce our speaker, but I'm going to do it myself this evening. Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Gudzinski, Marketing Associate for Manitowoc Public Library. Kevin M. Kelly has been on the law school staff of University of Wisconsin-Madison since 1998. He received a BS with honors in Foreign Service from Georgetown University and his JD with honors from the University of Wisconsin, where he was editor-in-chief of the Wisconsin Law Review. Following graduation from law school, Mr. Kelly served as a criminal defense attorney and staff judge advocate in the U.S. Navy Judge Advocate General Corps and was stationed at San Francisco and Scotland. In addition to his law school student and academic affair duties, Mr. Kelly is an officer in the Naval Reserve, specializing in military operational law and international law issues. Teaches courses on the law of armed conflict and on the just war tradition. In 2003, he was recalled to active duty, serving as the NATO legal advisor to the Peace Stabilization Force, SFOR, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, as well as on the U.S. European Command Headquarters staff during the Iraq War. His current assignment is Commanding Officer, U.S. Naval Forces Europe-Africa 6th Fleet Legal Reserve Unit. His immediate past assignments were to the Office of the Judge Advocate General of the Navy, International and Operational Law, Pentagon, and as Commanding Officer of the U.S. Naval War College International Law Department Reserve Unit in Newport, Rhode Island. Associate Dean Kelly represented the law school on the Wisconsin Board of Bar Examiners from 2000 to 2006. And I'm sure those aren't even all the highlights. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Kelly.
Tim, thanks very much. That's very kind of you. Can everybody hear me okay? Not, all right, great. I'm going to turn this on and check my forward. Okay. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Manitowoc is one of my absolute favorite places in the state. I love coming here. My kids and I have been on the SS Badger 3 different times. I've spent 3 nights on the sub with Cub Scouts. So nobody was dropping depth charges, but it seemed like it. And I have to say, this is one of the most beautiful library buildings that any community could have. So you're You're very fortunate. So again, good evening. Thank you very much for the very kind invitation. So tonight's topic is global engagement in the U.S. military. It's a big topic to cover in, half hour, 40 minutes. I want to approach it, if I may, not from the four divergent theories that are outlined in the materials, but from three different kind of real-world contexts and examples of global engagement. The first one, and I'll try not to go on too long about this, but the first one is about the U.S. military being prepared to fight a major conflict. And I decided to pick Korea as the example there because it's in the news, and there's a lot of talk about it, but what would the wartime eventualities be? What are the pressure points? What are the various scenarios under that in that context? And then I want to talk about, and this is, I have to apologize in advance for, there's kind of a Navy focus here, not only because of that's my background, but also from the standpoint of global engagement. The Navy is sometimes viewed as a non-doctrinal force, and that, the Army has warfighting doctrine, right? They train, and there's some of them are deployed, but a lot of them are stateside, right? And they're training in the event of deployment. And same with the Air Force. But from the standpoint of constantly projecting power, that's something the Navy does all the time. And indeed, whether they're a lot of times the difference between wartime and peacetime for the Navy is merely when they take off, are they actually coming back with the bombs or not, or are they leaving with bombs? And so from an operational standpoint and from the standpoint of global engagement, the Navy is an interesting and expensive case study. And what the Navy does, it projects power, but it also protects U.S. and other maritime nations' interests. And so from the standpoint of global engagement, it's vitally important. And then I'm going to conclude with, albeit somewhat of a minor and less prominent aspect of U.S. Military global engagement, and that is, what do we do with regard to assisting allies and other nations militarily from, a training standpoint, for instance. The kind of operational support, it's great if you can do it, if you have the forces. And I'm going to use examples from my own reserve unit with regard to what we do in U.S. Naval Forces Africa. Now, I should say that I'm here in my academic capacity, right? I'm not speaking for the U.S. Navy, not speaking for the DoD. I am a Navy Reserve captain, but any views I express, if I slip out and express a view, they're my own. I do want, and let me show you my first slide here. And this is how the U.S. military views the world, right? It's all divided up, and I currently work for Naval Forces Europe and Naval Forces Africa, and 6th Fleet, which is actually there's two major combatants commands, U.S. European Command and U.S. Africa Command, and the naval forces of that are split between the two, and then 6th Fleet is basically all this ocean area in here. So it's basically 14 million square miles of land and 20 million square nautical miles of sea, and 67% of the Earth's coastline, something like well over 100 nations. But I previously, as Tim said, I've worked at the Pentagon and the Naval War College, so I was able to pick up some things along the way that will kind of inform at least a view of global engagement. Also, I should say, and as Tim pointed out, I'm a judge advocate, which means I'm a lawyer. I'm not a naval strategist. The good thing about that is, from the standpoint of global engagement, the law matters. It matters an awful lot when it comes to the law of the sea and what nations do on the sea. So it's actually relevant. Naval strategy is a lot of times about how you're going to fight wars, but of course what the Navy does is much more than fighting wars. A lot of times it is enforcing the law of the sea. And maritime nations' prerogatives under the law of the sea. So, as I indicated, I had to say I found the reduction to the broad terms that are in the materials. If you read them, they have four different takes on global engagement. One is unilateral preeminence, and the next one was multilateral leadership, and the third one is unilateral restraint, and the fourth is assertive nationalism. And when I read that, it was a little bit like, I've been in the Navy for 26 years, and we don't really talk in those terms about what we do. And I was a little reminded when I was in college studying international affairs or something, there would be some great scholar that would look back on what the U.S. foreign policy was in any given time, and then they would reduce it to 3 or 4 or 5 different bullet points. And I always said, I wonder if the people who are actually in charge of that foreign policy knew about all those categories that they were being put into. Because it can be, for me, sometimes categories like that, they're a little neat, you know, somewhat academic. With regard to these, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 currents, they all kind of run together sometimes. And not necessarily to the exclusion of any one. For instance, the first one, which is the material points out, it talks about unilateral preeminence as preserving U.S. hegemony as much as possible, the Pax Americana. But you know, kind of like the caricature of the, you know, the hawkish foreign and military policy. But I think even less hawkish administrations or congressional leaders would actually be very happy with unilateral preeminence, as long as it's not too costly. And even with regard to number 2, multilateral leadership, there are a lot of hawks who might think one is absolutely vital, but they'd be very happy if there's multilateral military action, as long as U.S. national interests get preserved. So there's kind of a bleed over with regard to these. I think I might come back to this slide later, but so here are the 4 areas. And with regard to the third one, the unilateral restraint, I think the materials point out, well, that hasn't really been done for about 70 years. It kind of characterizes U.S. military policy pre-World War I and pre-World War II, right? And I have an example of U.S. Army officers in the 1930s, which you know, my own grandfather could have been one of these officers. He was in World War I and in World War II, but you know, in the 1930s, I understand he'd go off to the weekend maneuvers, and back in the 1930s, the U.S. Army was smaller than the Army of Romania, right? And so there's I think a lot of people said that it was irresponsibly small, and that was not only were we not ready for the World War that came, but maybe if the U.S. forces had been more involved globally, more engaged globally, the circumstances that led to the war would have been different. But even with regard to unilateral restraint, there are a lot of occasions where the U.S. military actually does engage in unilateral restraint writ small, but not writ large, as any kind of, I wonder how I did that. Interesting. Tim. I went back to my title page for some reason. Maybe I pressed something. Oh, there we go. I must have pressed here. I'll stay away from that button. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to use this button and just use this as the pointer. These of course, the opposite of 1930s Army officers on maneuvers. These are current special forces. I shouldn't say opposite, but it's an example of constant training and constant awareness of what level of skill you're at and what kind of environment you are projecting power from. This would be from the sea. They might have been landed by submarine. And then with regard to the fourth topic, assertive nationalism, I mean, one could say the assertive nationalism is a little bit like unilateral preeminence. I mean, it's certainly unilateral preeminence, number one, is a great, there's a lot of assertion there. Nationalism is not really, it's not a concept that gets used by military planners, but I guess it could be reflected in the foreign and military policy of it. But I would view number 4 as being something that is going to get reflected in maybe 1 and 2, not necessarily 3 so much. So I had a hard time looking at military policy being something that is constructed along these 3 or 4 lines. The author said that the assertive nationalists would be, for instance, more interested in an 8 U.S. carrier strike forces rather than the current 11. But that would certainly be a great diminution with respect to how much one is going to be able to, with regard to 3, whether one is going to be able to project the power that we're used to. So anyways, the numbers, this is a slide, it's a couple of years old, and I guess it's a visual representation of the Navy's 282 approximate ships, and of course with regard to the preeminence vision, the author talks about, well, we should be looking closer, approaching a 350 ship Navy. But numbers are relevant because the article goes into this. Numbers are relevant because they directly relate to what you can do with regard to either projecting power or fighting. So as we discuss this today, I just want to mention those 3 or 4 different themes. They could be leitmotifs as we talk about what, in the 3 areas I'm going to talk about, Korea, law of the sea, and equipping or training allied and non-allied forces. What are the different themes that that you can pick up on? I don't think it's all one or the other. I wanted to talk about Korea to begin with, and it's in the news a lot, and this is kind of an odd slide. It's like, well, what is this? This is a North Korean freighter called the Sosan, and this is relevant because the Sosan, back in December 2002, before there were any North Korean nuclear tests, this freighter was being tracked by U.S. intelligence and the U.S. Navy, and it was not flying flag. We knew it was a North Korean freighter. It didn't want to identify itself as a North Korean freighter. It was hailed. It wouldn't respond. Wouldn't fly a flag. And so under the law of the sea, it was viewed as being a stateless vessel. And as a stateless vessel, it's able to be boarded. And so the Sosan was boarded by Spanish Marines off the Horn of Africa. And in the hold was discovered 15 Scud missiles. They're in these crates. They were hidden under thousands of bags of cement. Now, the thing about it is it was actually a lawful transfer. The country of Yemen said, those are actually our Scuds, we bought them. So one could say, what were the North Koreans up to? Maybe they didn't want it known that they were engaged in this, in the marketing of Scuds. There were some explosive warheads that came with this, some dual-use material as well. But there was authority to stop and search this ship. As it happens, there was no authority to keep it, however. And it had the Navy let it, instead of impounding the vessel, let it continue on to Yemen. Now, the issue here is it had the air of contraband to it. I mean, this is a ship that's not identified. The papers, by the way, when the Spanish Marines were rappelling out of the helicopter, they didn't know what they were going to encounter. All right? They didn't know if there were people on the deck were going to be shooting at them or shoot the helicopter out of the sky. So there was the air of contraband, but it turned out it was an entirely above-board transaction. So this is it's an example of a boarding. Now, as I think about it, the master of the North Korean vessel, if he had just been flying the North Korean flag, would not have been boarded. Because one of the things, you're in international waters, you have to get flag state consent. If your ship is not engaged in piracy, not engaged in the slave trade, not engaged in illegal broadcast, you are pretty much inviolate unless your flag state, in this case the North Korean, said, yeah, you can board that vessel. The other exception is if the United Nations Security Council resolutions authorizes the boarding, right? And at this time, there was no problem with what the Sosan was doing. So off it goes on its way. So I have it there because it's interesting and it plays a role later on and in the current situation with regard to sanctions and North Korea. Because there's currently a sanctions regime. There are 8 or 9 different sanctions in place by the UN Security Council resolution. And so fast forward a few years later, and I'm working on something at the Pentagon that has to do with, it's a theoretical question, what can the Navy do to board a vessel that is violating, we think, the UN Security Council resolutions? The problem is, the UN Security Council resolutions, although it banned certain arms trade by the North Koreans, did not authorize non-consensual boarding, right? So, and if the Security Council resolutions had been written that way, probably would have sustained a veto at the Security Council level, right? Probably the Russians or the Chinese would have authorized that. So we're in an odd situation where the Security Council has banned certain trade in certain instrumentalities, whether things connected with weapons writ large or instrumentalities connected with the nuclear arms development and transfer. But there's no ability to actually board and stop the ship. And so that was a legal issue. And it's something that all the way up until this past fall and then some, the U.S. has been trying to resolve, to do something with respect to that Security Council resolutions not authorizing the boarding, because there's holes in the sanctions, right? And so that is a difficulty, but every time it gets raised at the Security Council level to actually fix the sanction regime, the answer is no. Because, usually because the 2 states that I mentioned are not going to sustain that. So that's a difficulty into the current sanctions regime, right? So we had under this scenario a lawful stopping, and now what you're going to have is the North Korean freighter is going to be making sure that they're flying their flag and not given any reason to be stopped. So you're not going to be able to rappel down and find out what's on board, because that's interfering with international trade. So I want to talk a little bit about the deployment of U.S. forces with respect to Korea. Now, I could also view these next couple slides I kind of view as the taxpayer slide. It's not just kind of boring military stuff, but it's actually a rather expensive deployment scenario. This is a little bit better slide. And among the U.S. Forces in the area, there's 23,000 U.S. soldiers in South Korea. And the U.S. Army rotates about a new armored brigade in every 9 months. By the way, did I press the button again? There we go. There we go. I better be careful of this thing. A brigade is about 35,000 soldiers and 100 tanks and 100 Bradley fighting vehicles. Also in Korea is they're under the command of the U.S. 8th Army and with the 2nd Infantry Division there. So can see where Korea is located with relation to Japan and China. So the Army also has a combat aviation brigade in South Korea with about 60 Apache helicopters and Black Hawks and Chinooks. There's an artillery brigade there, long-range artillery fire. There's another artillery brigade to protect air bases. There's also a thing called the THAAD, the Theater High Altitude Area Defense Missile System, which is meant to protect against incoming short, medium, and intermediate range ballistic missiles. Right. And there are some U.S. Air Force fighter wings in South Korea. Beyond the peninsula, there's an aircraft carrier and other surface ships at Yokosuka. Okay, you can see right in the midpoint there. So a carrier task force is out of there, which will include 2 guided missile cruisers and 7 guided missile destroyers. Although 2 of those guided missile destroyers are currently out of action because you might have seen there were some collisions. You might have read about that, the Fitzgerald and the McCain. In Sasebo, there's an amphibious assault ship, the Bonhomme Richard, and Sasebo is there. And an amphibious task force is there. Basically a U.S. Marine Corps infantry battalion. There's with armor, artillery, and aviation. It's called a MU, a Marine Expeditionary Unit. There's also a U.S. Air Force fighter wing at Misawa. And Misawa is right up there. And it specializes in suppression of enemy air defenses. And there are close to 50 F-16s there. There is another air base at Yokota. You can see that right underneath Misawa, Yokota. That's a big airlift wing. The Marines have an air station at Iwakuni. And you can see Iwakuni is right there. And also, they have 3 squadrons of helicopters at another Marine Corps air station called Futenma on Okinawa, and that is not on the map, but Okinawa is down there. But also at Okinawa, there's Kadena Air Force Base with 2 more F-15 squadrons, and there's also refueling aircraft like KC-135s and AWACS. On Guam, on Guam, there is a submarine squadron, Submarine Squadron 15, 4 forward deployed nuclear attack submarines and a sub-tender. There's another one of those THAAD ballistic missile defense units there. It was placed there in 2013 in case of North Korean attack of intermediate range ballistic missiles. And also at Andersen Air Force Base on Guam, there's B-1 bombers there, also a lot of tankers and a lot of drones, but also it can easily be plussed up with more B-1s and B-2s and B-52s from the continental United States. Now, I mentioned just recently about the possibility of an attack on Guam. The North Korean ballistic missiles currently have sufficient range easily to cover the 2,100 miles to Guam. There are questions about the accuracy, and there's question about if they were nuclear armed missiles, can they survive re-entry? And Guam would of course be a key element in any U.S. operation involving North Korea. So is it, what's the scenario by which there be some sort of, and this has been discussed in a lot, you might have seen in the news is there a bloody nose strategy for North Korea? What would the prospect be of a preemptive North Korean attack? And some say the idea of a preemptive attack was given the most currency back in 1993 and 1994, but it would be even harder to do it now. The North Korean forces are more dispersed. They are in more hardened shelters than they were at the time. There's questions about how good is the intel about where the North's military facilities are, and they have more increased road mobile launch vehicles. Diplomatically, it would certainly be hard next to impossible to get support in advance for such an attack. China and Russia would certainly veto it at the Security Council level, and South Korea and Japan, quite frankly, would be likely to oppose such an attack. The U.S. could conceivably take unilateral action, and this goes to the heart of the matter, though, because there's an estimated 10,000 artillery pieces and rocket launchers aimed right at Seoul, which is the home of 10 million people, and it's only 35 miles from the DMZ. So that's perhaps the most obvious insurance policy against a U.S. Attack. And many of these facilities that are artillery and missile launch capabilities that are pointed at Seoul are actually in hardened artillery sites that are dug into mountainsides or hillsides, and so they can fire and move back in, and they'd be very difficult to actually attack. So the idea of a preemptive attack is a very difficult one. What if the North Koreans were to attack first? I guess some analysts have said that would only be likely if, for instance, they thought an attack was inevitable, or maybe if the leader, Kim Jong-un, feels that he's personally threatened with death or with exile. So what would the North do under that scenario? Well, presumably they would maybe want to move troops through tunnels that have been excavated underneath the demilitarized zone. There would be commando units in the south that they'd be landed by submarine. There would be lots of sleeper agents that would be activated. There are many, many thousands of North Korean Special Forces commandos, paratroopers, saboteurs that would cross the border by air or by sea. And the North would probably attempt to physically overrun the South defenses by sheer numbers. South Korea has some 660,000 soldiers in arms, where there's 24,000 U.S. troops, but the North has an active force of over 1 million. Some have estimated that if the North Koreans were to launch an attack, there would be about 4 days of fierce fighting. And the father of Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il, used to say he had a 3-day timetable. He would talk about occupying South Korea all the way to Busan in 3 days. As the idea being the 4th day might be where there'd be a turning point. So in the event of such an attack, a North Korean attack, the U.S. would carry out extensive missile attacks against the North's command and control. Military facilities, including Kim Jong-un's leadership, would presumably be targeted. Once the North Korean forces left the 160-mile-long DMZ, there would be many obstacles that would be put in place to slow and stop the armored and mechanized units before they could reach Seoul. And the plan would obviously be to keep the Korean People's Army as close to the DMZ as possible to prevent the breakout all the way to Busan, which is down in the south on the coast. So. Great concern of the planners under the scenario is, well, what if even if the war were to start conventionally, would it stay that way? The North obviously has nuclear weapons. Some analysts believe that they've already achieved miniaturization with regard to the nuclear devices on the missiles. Short-range nuclear missiles could be launched at troop concentrations and civilian centers in South Korea or Japan. And North Korea is also believed to have significant stockpiles of chemical weapons, and indeed chemical weapons that can be delivered by artillery shells. So the North Korean military, as I said, 1 million soldiers, actually 1.1 million. It's 5% of the total population. 70% of it is deployed within 60 miles of the border. They are believed to be underfed, ill-equipped, poorly trained, but they have 4,300 tanks, 2,500 armored vehicles, 1,300 aircraft. Their air force is the second largest, second to the ground forces. Their best plane is a MiG-29, which is the Fulcrum. It's a pretty good plane. There's 35 of them, approximately. They have some MiG-21s and MiG-23s. Most of the Air Force is, these are kind of knockoffs of the MiG-17 and MiG-19. They're called the J-5 and the J-6, and they're not good planes. And they've been described as sponges for U.S. And South Korean missiles. So sponges in that they could be shot out of the sky relatively easily. The difficulty is we would be shooting down using very expensive missiles, very cheap and poor planes, poorly piloted, but we'd be compelled to shoot them down because one of the issues is that we don't know if they would be carrying chemical or biological weapons. So you would be, instead of just letting them go, you might need to shoot them down. And indeed, shooting down a plane that's carrying chemical or biological weapons is a difficult proposition in and of itself. The North Korean Navy is the smallest branch. By the way, these are a couple of slides that illustrate the ground forces and the air forces and the naval forces. The North Korean Navy is the smallest branch. They do have 430 combatant ships, but a lot of those are just patrol vessels. They have something like 250 amphibious ships, which would be used to land troops on either side of the Korean Peninsula. It's not a tremendous navy, but they do have 70 submarines, which would make it a very, very dangerous environment for U.S. and South Korean ships. The other thing about the North Korean Navy is it can't coordinate, and never has coordinated, between their east and west coasts. It's a little bit in that regard. If anybody has any experience in the U.S. Navy, there's always the question about, are you an East Coast sailor or a West Coast sailor? But we have the continental United States between us, so there's something of an excuse for that. But so very close, but not a lot of operational training. The North Koreans have somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,500 multiple rocket launchers. I should say that the Republic of Korea forces, I had mentioned that they have somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 or 620,000 active troops, a fair amount of fighter attack aircraft, 2,600 tanks, self-propelled artillery, and their Navy has a very large amphibious assault ship, but other than that, they are basically frigates and destroyers and some corvettes. Of biggest concern with respect to North Koreans are the missiles. Now, they have, under Kim Jong-un, conducted 80 missile tests, and I'm not talking about nuclear tests, just the missile tests, and testing the capabilities of the ballistic missiles. 80 missile tests, so it's far more than under his father and grandfather. There's an unknown number of nuclear bombs, maybe between 30 to 60. North Korea has conducted 6 nuclear tests. The one carried out in September 2017, was by far the biggest. At first, the blast was thought to have succeeded 100 kilotons. Now, the Hiroshima bomb was 16 kilotons. More recent analysis has suggested that the September 2017 blast was as big as 250 kilotons. So that's lent a certain amount of credence to this perhaps being a thermonuclear or a hydrogen blast. Within a few weeks of the September 27 bomb test, there was a test of a Hwasong-15 ICBM. And that's the one you might remember. It went up very high, about 2,700 miles, flew about 600 miles laterally, and then landed off of Japan. The news media was reporting that as in Japanese waters, but it meant the Japanese exclusive economic zone, not Japanese territorial waters. We're going to talk about the EEZ and what that means. But the Hwasong-15 has a range of about 8,000 miles. So if it's fired on a flatter trajectory, it could reach anywhere on the U.S. mainland. And as I said, there are doubts about the accuracy of North Korean ballistic missiles because of the reliance on, among other things, antiquated Soviet guidance systems. And so the situation with regard to close a little bit about North Korea and the situation there, obviously we have a lot of forward deployed forces. The North Korean forces are not inconsiderable, or the South Korean forces are not inconsiderable, but there's a quandary. The quandary is, how do you prevent or act preemptively without causing a scenario worse than the current one, the current situation you're at? I think of it in terms of General MacArthur. If you remember him being relieved from command by President Truman, or if you remember reading about that, he wanted to do what? He wanted to attack the Chinese mainland, right? And President Truman thought that was going to widen the war. And he didn't want that. So that did not meet with, that didn't align with what the president thought was the imperatives to avoid a wider war. But General MacArthur was looking at it from the standpoint of, well, yeah, but then we're going to have a stalemate on the peninsula, right? So under the scenario we are at right now, if you want to address the situation, how do you address the situation without potentially having a much worse outcome, right? If you were to address it, how do you avoid untold thousands of civilian deaths in Seoul and elsewhere? And also, how do you do it? You risk all-out war in trying to remove the nuclear threat, right? But all of this is just a way of looking at global engagement and the forward deployment of U.S. forces given this particular threat scenario. I'm not here to suggest what the solution is, and obviously there might be talks in May, who knows. This is the current threat posture, and it involves global engagement in an actual warfighting scenario. Not an ideal warfighting scenario, not a great one, given the North Korean nuclear capabilities, not one that is necessarily, lopsided in favor of the United States. And certainly with regard to the posture of the South Korean civilian population, not an ideal scenario. So moving from the warfighting scenario to the next scenario. These are two U.S. destroyers. It's pretty obvious that they're U.S. destroyers, right? They're flying the flags like that for a reason. They're doing what's called freedom of navigation operations. They're out there trying to enforce the U.S., and not exclusively the U.S., a lot of maritime nations view with regard to excessive maritime claims, right? If a state is trying to assert a maritime boundary that is, for lack of a better phrase, lack of a better term, illegal under international law, there's going to be a freedom of navigation operation, because if other states acquiesce to an excessive claim, after a certain number of years, it might take on the character of being respected and therefore maybe could be viewed as legal under certain circumstances. So these are very obvious challenges that are done. There's records made of them, and they want no doubt that the United States and other maritime nations don't regard the excessive claim as lawful. And these are, of course, these are peacetime operations. And you can do this if you have sufficient forces to do it. And they're hopefully peacetime operations. There were some famous examples of the U.S. being involved in freedom of navigation operations in the Black Sea, and the Soviets were coming out and bumping the ships. But there was no live fire exchanged. This first example is potentially the easiest. Under that scenario, there is a rock or an island that is claimed by a state, let's say China, but that state says, oh, well, if you're going to exercise a thing called innocent passage, in other words, you're going to come within our territorial sea, 12 nautical miles, we demand that you let us know in advance that you're going to do it. Now, under the law of the sea, you don't have to do that. as long as you are just passing right through, you're not engaging in any military operations, you're not zigzagging, you're not conducting drills, you're not, especially things like live fire training exercise. That would be a very rash and impulsive and insulting thing to do in somebody else's territorial sea. But if you're just passing through, under international law, you're allowed to do it. But if you're a state that says, we want to know in advance, the United States, for instance, says, no, we're not going to let you know in advance, we're just going to do it. We're going to go through, and we're going to steam through expeditiously. We're going to come right through. We're not going to deviate the pattern. We're not going to do any other kind of drills. So that's a very simple challenge. Another one would be non-recognition of a territorial sea. For instance, there's a low tide elevation. It's a rock that spends a good part of its day underwater. A nation might say, oh, that's our island. Or it might even say, that's our rock. If it's a rock and it's above water, it gets a 12-mile territorial sea around it, right? So they want it to be above water all the time because that's 12 miles of territorial sea and a rock in the middle of, let's say, the South China Sea. Well, the problem is if it's underwater, a lot of times it's a low tide elevation and it's not a rock. It doesn't get any territorial sea at all, and it's certainly not an island. So this would be passing through, and you might even want to do that. You can go through that, and you would maybe want to even conduct some operations you wouldn't normally do in a territorial sea. You might do a man overboard drill or something because you're saying specifically, this isn't a territorial sea. We're going to treat it like international waters, which is what it is, right? So, non-recognition of a territorial sea. This is a really important one. Military activities in an exclusive economic zone. Exclusive economic zone is that part that goes out 200 miles from a nation's coast where the coastal state enjoys exclusive rights with regard to natural resources, fishing, the seabed, oil, any other kind of exploration. It's exclusive economic zone, all right? However, high seas freedoms still pertain, right? So, including conducting military operations. And this is a tremendous point of contention between the United States and China, which I have some more slides on about some very particular and dangerous incidents that have occurred. But what you would do in this scenario is you would conduct military operations in an exclusive economic zone. For instance, you would do subwater surveys. What does the seabed look like? Now, that's a military operation, but you're allowed to do it. It's international waters. You're not fishing. You're not trying to exploit the coastal state's oil reserves or anything like this, but you are able to engage in, for instance, undersea surveys, or do anything else. You can engage in gunnery practice, as long as you don't interfere with the economic rights that the coastal state does. In this case, you conduct them, and you very specifically say, we're allowed to do this. This is your exclusive economic zone, but we're conducting military operations here because we can. Unfortunately, it's not a universally held view with regard to the exclusive economic zone. When it was developed, and it's a relatively new concept going back to the end of World War II, President Truman again proclaimed the first exclusive economic zone, the Gulf of Mexico. But it was always in the context of high seas freedoms. All nations still enjoy whatever high seas freedoms you have in, for instance, the Gulf of Mexico. Right? Just don't mess around with the exclusive economic zone with respect to resources. Freedom of overflight is another one. There are some states that will say, over our exclusive economic zone, you must let us know in advance before you fly a plane over it. That's absolutely the case with respect to area over a territorial sea. That's not the case with regard to exclusive economic zone. You might recall that there was a very well-publicized incident where a U.S. P-3 was collided with a Chinese fighter near the Chinese island of Hainan and actually had to crash land. The Chinese pilot was killed. It's in a fighter aircraft. And the U.S. plane was there conducting surveillance over the exclusive economic zone of China. And the Chinese said, well, you can't do that. Well, sure we can. It's 200 miles off your coast. You can fly there, we can fly there, you can fly 200 miles off our coast. So this is part of the freedom of navigation operations that will be conducted on a regular basis. So this is just a couple other examples. This one involves the Fiery Cross Reef and the Spratlys. Now, this reef happens to be occupied by China. It's claimed by China, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. They all claim it. Okay? The Chinese are occupying it. And at the time of this freedom of navigation operation was conducted, it was not known, the matter was before an international arbitration, was this a rock, okay, or was it an island? There was a dispute about that. And now the U.S. view was, we don't know whether, we're going to listen to see what the arbitration says, we don't know if it's a rock or an island, and we definitely don't know who owns it. But we do know, if we come within 12 miles of it, under innocent passage, we don't have to let anybody know that we're going to do that, right? And so that's what was done in this case. They just came within 12 nautical miles of which turned out to be a rock, right? Now you'll notice this rock, it doesn't look like much of a rock because there's an island being constructed there, right? The arbitration was that this was a rock, it's above high tide, so it's a rock, and so whosever island it is, whether it's China, Vietnam, Taiwan, or the Philippines, and the arbitration did not determine that. The arbitration is not to determine who owns particular features, but where the boundaries are, and who has various, where, for instance, the Territorial Sea boundaries are, or the exclusive economic zone boundaries. We don't know who owns it, but we know it's a rock. And because it's a rock, it has a 12-mile territorial sea around it. Now China says it's ours, meaning it's a Chinese island. Why do you say it's an island? Well, look at it. We've built it up, and now it's an island. And since it's an island, it doesn't have just a 12 nautical mile territorial sea around it. It has an exclusive economic zone that goes out 200 miles around it, because islands get an exclusive economic zone. Right? So that's what, if you're wondering, what's all that island building about? That's what it's about. Right? Now, the arbitration says, however, you can't make islands that way. You have to go back to what it was originally, and this was a rock. Right? So you got that much, whoever it is, you're above the tide. Right? So whoever owns it, you got 12 miles. You don't have 200. Right, so all the fisheries and oil and everything that's around that, whoever it is, that's international waters, not part of any EEZ. Right, so you don't get to do that by constructing this, whatever it is, non-island. See, an island has to be life-sustaining naturally. Usually it means there usually has to be water connected with it, not something that's brought in, not water that's brought in on tanks. It has to be a natural island. So this was an easy one. This was this rock thing. Whoever owns it, we're not going to let you know in advance before we come within 12 nautical miles. This is interesting in that this is the paracels. This top one here, and this involves straight baselines. This is again, China claiming that these features are Chinese, and that not only do they got 12 nautical miles around them, but it's actually a big box, and you can't come in here without asking us in advance. or telling us, informing us that you're coming in. And without going into too much detail, the kind of straight baselines here are not lawful, right? You're going to get 12 nautical miles around these features, but you can't do a big box around them, right? So what the USS Decatur did here is it actually didn't come within 12 nautical miles of any one of these features, but it went right through the box, right? As a way of saying, oh, we're not going to mess around with the territorial sea of all these things. Well, we're going to come into the little box, which is international waters as far as we're concerned, and we're going to loiter, we're going to maneuver, do different kind of drills, we're going to do man overboard drills. We're not doing innocent passage here. Because innocent passage would mean we think that this is your territorial sea and we're just going straight. We don't think this is your territorial sea. These are improper baselines. Now the Mischief Reef, this is the USS Dewey, and this involved lands that was claimed again by China, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. Now, the arbitration said that this was a low tide elevation. So, since it's a low tide elevation, it's not a territorial sea at all. So we're going to come in within 12 miles, and we're going to zigzag, do different drills, because we're saying the reason we can do that is because that's not a territorial sea. It's a low tide elevation. No, it's not. It's an island. No, it's not an island. It's not even a rock. It's a low tide elevation, right? No matter what you put on, it's a low tide elevation. And so these things are conducted all the time, freedom of navigation operations. And you have to have a lot of ships to do it. It's expensive. But the reason it's important, and it's not just important from the United States point of view, it's important for any kind of maritime state to do this. Now, speaking of other maritime states, right? Exclusive economic zones. As I mentioned, these are areas that are exclusively devoted to the coastal states, exclusive use with respect to resources. Now, in light blue on this map are all the exclusive economic zones globally, including disputed ones over here. See the disputed area right there. And one can imagine that if the United States and other nations were not to specifically say, no, military operations that are normally part of high seas freedoms can go on in an exclusive economic zone. If that doesn't get contested, and other maritime nations as well go along with it, there's an enormous amount of water that suddenly becomes more like a territorial sea than an exclusive economic zone. There's a lot of places where navies can't go, right? And a lot of these places where navies can't go actually can be pretty close to maritime choke points and in very important straits, because 90% of global trade goes by sea, right? And a lot of that global trade has to be protected by shipping under certain circumstances, by naval shipping. And so if those navies can't operate, then that becomes a more difficult scenario to be able to keep the sea lanes open. So you can see with the revolution in exclusive economic zones, the idea is that this is going to benefit the coastal state, but it wasn't done with a view towards restricting military operations in the EEZ. Here's another more recent example with respect to another claim that the United States doesn't recognize, the annexation of the Crimea. Right? So this is the Territorial Sea and the EEZ of the Ukraine prior to annexation. And this is what it would be, or what it purports to be under annexation. You see Russia has now more territorial sea and also more EEZ. Right? These are American EEZs. The different colors don't signify other than the fact this is labeling, but these are areas, though, and the U.S. is very clear that if a state says, well, we can conduct military operations in your EEZ, the U.S. position is, yes, you may, absolutely, because it's international waters, right? So I mentioned earlier about the North Korean ballistic missile that comes down and they say in Japanese water. They meant the Japanese EEZ, right? And sometimes when that's reported, it makes it sound like, well, really, that North Korean missile came down in Japanese waters. That's awful close to Japan. It was in the EEZ, so it means it's within 200 miles of the Japanese coast. But it's international waters. But it may not be high seas, which is areas beyond the EEZ, but it is still international water. So it's not like they offended Japan by actually landing a missile on either Japanese territory or the Japanese Territorial Sea. These are People's Republic of China, EEZs, and as you can see, there's an extensive area, and there's some disputed areas as well. But the particular problem with China is they very much lean forward when they say, our EEZ means your military has to stay out. It becomes a very big area in the Western Pacific where foreign militaries can't go. It also happens to be incredibly important shipping lanes. Now, this slide's important because if you take a look at the dotted line here, okay, this is sometimes called the cow's tongue, sometimes called the 9-dash line, sometimes called the 11-dash line. There are two actually they're not conflicting claims, so they don't sit well together. In addition to China saying that it has very, very expansive rights in its EEZ, it also says, actually, this is our territorial sea. So the claim is that this is their territorial sea, and so all these nations here, Vietnam, Philippines, Bhutan's down here, or Brunei's down here, they actually don't have much of an EEZ at all, because this is territorial sea, Chinese territorial sea, which, by the way, both Taiwan and People's Republic of China claim this. Now, the arbitration that I mentioned said, no, it's not territorial sea of China, and there isn't any historical record that would back up the claim. This would be the EEZ right here, and up here, this is an incident, the location of an incident involving the Impeccable, which is a U.S. auxiliary ship that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. And when I mentioned earlier the US P3, it was right about around, the plane had to crash land on Hainan, right? So it's over the Chinese EEZ. So that was a dispute over military operations over the EEZ, and I'm going to skip over that. This is, by the way, disputed boundaries up in the Arctic, right? As you can see, there's actually a dispute with regard to the United States and Canada, right there over the boundary. Lots of overlapping claims. This slide actually talks about some disputes regarding extended continental shelf, which is beyond the bounds of the presentation, but and I mentioned strategic straits and how important they are, and this is a quick expression of the strategic straits around the world and where they are, and it becomes very important if it starts to run afoul of or comes uncomfortably close to EEZs where military activities may or may not be allowed. Okay, this is the case of the U.S. naval ship Impeccable back in 2009. So this is the Impeccable. It's conducting subsurface survey. Ships from the People's Republic of China came out and interfered with it, throwing things in the way of the ship, trying to chase it off, trying to damage the propulsion system. And there were a couple more incidents like this with other ships. So this is where the Impeccable was again. Now, this is the law of high seas freedoms under the exclusive, in the exclusive economic zone, right? High seas freedoms. What are high seas freedoms? I'm quoting a very famous international lawyer, Oppenheim, who talks about the freedom of open seas involves perfect navigation for all vessels of all nations, whether they are warships, men of war, other public vessels, or merchantmen, right? The EZ is still international waters. This is Article 58 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. In the EZ, all states enjoy freedoms referred to in Article 87, which is entitled Freedom of the High Seas, of navigation and overflight, and the laying of submarine cables and pipelines, and other internationally lawful uses of the sea related to those freedoms, such as those associated with the operation of ships or aircraft. This is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, I wish that it actually said, and by the way, this includes military operations, right? It does read between the lines. There were some other nations at the time that said, well, I don't want to be that clear about it, hoping maybe that we have some room to maneuver later on. I don't want it there in black and white exactly. Now, this is the Chinese law in the EZ. Any nation shall enjoy the freedom of navigation in and overflight of the exclusive economic zone of the People's Republic of China, and the expediency of other lawful uses of the sea related to the above freedoms, under condition that the laws and regulations of the People's Republic of China are complied with. Well, you either have the right to do it under international law or not. That's why it's international law and the law of the sea. A coastal state doesn't get to say, yeah, no. You have the right to do whatever in anybody else's exclusive economic zone according to international law. It's of our EEZ, which is a creature of international law. We have this special kind of caveat on it, right? So, in addition to the island building, which has been in the news a lot recently, the military operations in the EEZ has been a tremendous contention between the U.S. And China and other maritime nations in China. The U.S. happens to be, because we have the force that we have size-wise, we're able to do a lot of challenges in this regard. So that's enough on freedom of navigation operations. So this was just the conclusion part. I wanted to talk about the third level of global engagement, right? The things that's nice to do if you can do it. Now, so I mentioned the command that I'm associated with, Naval Forces Europe, Naval Forces Africa, and 6th Fleet. Naval Forces Africa has a series of military exercises that we do every year. One's called Obangami Express, and one is called Phoenix Express, and one's called Cutlass Express. They involve different parts of Africa. It's on the screen: Central and Western Africa, Northern Africa, and Eastern Africa. The idea is to get African nations trained with Western militaries, the U.S., but not exclusively the U.S., a lot of European allies as well. With regard to, remember how I started with the Sosan and that North Korean freighter and the boarding that the Spanish Marines did? Well, international boardings are very important if you're going to enforce things. For instance, if you have a situation where you have a stateless vessel or a vessel that's engaged in proliferation and the coastal state wants to board, under certain circumstances you can board. So you might want to be doing maritime interdiction operations, for instance, if they're in your territorial sea, or proliferation security. And so this exercise, it involves a fair amount of personnel, and just so happens a lot of reserve personnel in the U.S. forces will go and train with the African nations on this. Now, it's something that, depending on your size of your naval forces, including your reserve forces, these are things you can do if you have a large enough, say, reserve force. You can meet your deployment schedules, you can meet your power projection, you can meet whatever kind of requirements you might have in a war-fighting scenario, but you can also do things like this, right? You may or may not be able to do it depending on funding levels, personnel levels. So the idea, the end state here is you could have African states developing state-of-the-art military operation centers like European or Canada or the United States have, to deal with a lot of the issues that are going on off of the African coast, especially the Gulf of Guinea, with a fair amount of smuggling and other issues. So this is a slide that we'll talk about. Well, what are the kind of things, what do the lawyers get involved, because if it involves boardings, it involves what's your legal basis for boarding. Are you in a territorial sea or not? If you're not in a territorial sea, you're going to have pretty careful contingencies before you do a boarding, because you might be interfering with the maritime rights of another state's flagged vessels. So, we will train on evidence collection, rules of engagement. What are the international agreements with regard to, say, proliferation security? The Proliferation Security Initiative was an idea that different flag states would come together and they say, if you suspect one of our flag vessels is involved in, say, providing weapons to non-state terrorist actors, or involved in nuclear proliferation or materials related thereto. If it's our flagged vessel, we're giving you in advance permission to stop it, right? So you don't have to actually ask, and maybe they get away. So all these states have come together, or the ones that have signed on, they've done it in advance as a way to deal with a proliferation issue. If they haven't signed up, you don't get to do it, unless it's involved, if they're in your territorial sea maybe, or otherwise there is the kind of the high bar of flag state authority, which is basically how we started. Okay, you can enforce things in the EEZ if somebody's involved in illegal fishing, for instance. Contiguous zone is another thing. It's a much smaller area than the EEZ, and coastal states can enforce different things with regard to immigration or fiscal, customs, sanitary laws, whatnot. I did it again. There we go. I did it again. Can't go back.
Which one is it?
Second to last. All the way down here. Yeah. Yeah. I know. We should move down one more. There we go. So, and as I started, whether if you're in international waters, piracy, slave trade, illegal broadcast, or is stateless. Otherwise, you have to have UN Security Council resolution to authorize the boarding. This would be an example of things that are done on the lower level to, a non-fleet action level, maybe a multinational, in this case, multinational exercises that we do with regard to different partners. They might be allies, they might be non-aligned, but it's, in one sense, you could have, the U.S. is somewhat shaping the enforcement regimen. It's not necessarily, although it could be, enforcement in the context of what U.S. and maybe allied interests are with respect to proliferation security. Sometimes they're going to go beyond that with regard to, for instance, anti-piracy. And the Chinese are involved in anti-piracy operations off of Eastern Africa. So those are the three areas kind of, that I wanted to touch on, just to kind of give a flavor of the global engagement, and admittedly, again, from somewhat of a naval perspective, but I'm happy to answer any kind of questions with regard to these or any other things you might find that you want to discuss. Yes, sir.
Back when you were discussing flagging, when you were discussing flagging of ships, there's recent sightings around Novosibirsk and that
Could you
they're
hold that closer? We
transshipping.
can't hear you.
What?
We can't hear you.
Grouped up one time. Is this better?
Yeah.
The sightings of Russian, not Russian, but North,
Closer to your mouth.
okay. North Korean ships, are those flagless or are they flagged? Because of the sanctions, they're transshipping. They're going to a Russian port, dropping stuff off,
Right.
and then it goes somewhere else.
Yeah, because the allegation that there are North Korean ships that are taking on oil, and coal. There's even been reports that there's a 10-mile border between North Korea and Russia, too. People kind of forget about that. It's not just the northern border, it's just with the People's Republic. There's about 10 miles with Russia. There's been allegations that there are actually coal trains that are going across. They are almost certainly, under this scenario, going to be flagged, right? Because if they're not flagged, they're leaving themselves open to a Sosan scenario, right? If you have a U.S. frigate, for instance, were to come up, or British or Dutch or anybody else who's trying to enforce the sanctions, and they hail a ship that's not flying a flag, especially if they don't get a response back, it can look like a stateless vessel, so they can board. Right, and it would be a different result, for instance, if they're boarding and they think, okay, well, we don't know whose vessel this is, but if these are North Korean, if this is a North Korean vessel, this is in contravention of the sanction, right? So we can't let it proceed. But the problem is, so you would have a non-consensual boarding there, but it would be lawful, right? Because the flag's not there. Now, so under the scenario where under the Sosan, when that skipper wasn't flying the North Korean flag, now I bet he is, if he's still alive, which is probably not the case. But you wouldn't, if you're the master of a North Korean vessel, you don't want to leave yourself open to a non-consensual boarding by looking stateless. So I think they are doing it. Now you can be tracked, and that means people can take embarrassing aerial photos, for instance, of what you might be transshipping. It's been, questions have been raised with regard to Chinese involvement in that, and I've heard a couple different things, including, China has a very large merchant fleet, and so the idea that the Chinese government is necessarily involved in these transshipment is an open question. They might know about it, they might not know about it.
These articles I saw were with
Russians, yeah, right. It's going to be it would be a difficult thing to prove. Although one of the things is that you could have national sanctions against particular shipping companies or particular vessels. If you can identify the vessel, you can have a sanction. It's like, well, that ship is not going in any Western port now. That would be, if you can get the intelligence on what it is. It also, depending on the scenario, can be embarrassing to, if you're a state like Russia or China that actually has voted the sanctions, to actually then being involved in or acquiescence in their being flouted could be embarrassing, depending on the level of proof that's brought. Certainly the Chinese have said, oh, that wasn't the government, we're going to deal with whoever was doing that. Well, that may or may not be the case.
Is there any credence to the 10-mile coal train theory?
I saw it in the open media, and it was, yeah. I know the train wasn't 10 miles long. The border's 10 miles.
That's what
yeah.
I'm sorry, I phrased
The train might have been 20 miles long.
Can a ship owner register his vessel in any country he wants?
Well, it would depend on, I think, what the national legislation says, whether that's allowed, but generally it's, you can flag your vessel, the flag's a convenience, and so you have a lot, like, Liberian, Panamanian, these are states where it's relatively easy to flag a vessel, with regard to there might be certain scenarios where, for instance, under American law, you may or may not be allowed to do that, depending on what the nature of your, there might be some aspects or some restrictions on what you're doing, but, I would imagine there would be some nations, China, for instance, that there might actually be, restrictions on how much foreign flagging you can do, or flags of convenience. But that would involve, you have to have an encyclopedic knowledge of the national maritime shipping laws of every state. Certainly, I think under American law, and certain, there can be certain national security scenarios where the shipping actually can be requisitioned by the government. So you're not going to be able to say, yeah, but I actually have that registered in as a flag of convenience in Panama. It's like, well, not any longer. So. Yes.
Before we get to that gentleman's question, there is a question on the other side of the room.
What other countries besides the United States carry out these freedom of navigation operations on a regular basis?
The key word there is regular, because you have to have, I think, the British, the Australians have done them. I think the Dutch have done them. It's not anything on the level of the U.S. Freedom of Navigation program. These are done on a not only on an annual basis, but there's a report to Congress. All the different operations are posted on the web. The idea is we want them to be open and notorious, because you're putting down a marker saying that we're not acquiescing to this claim.
What about China and Russia? Do they do those things through our economic zone?
Yeah, I mean, they certainly could. I don't know of any example of which they've done it. I think we've done freedom of navigation operations against Canada, and I assume they've done them back. The Coast Guards have been up there doing that. There wouldn't really be, with regard to the point about China, and I haven't heard, the Russian fleet doesn't really come out all that much, and they wouldn't really have a reason to come all this way, and the same with the Chinese, to we're going to conduct military operations off Hawaii, because the answer is, go ahead, right? Because the U.S. the U.S. leans forward very readily and repeatedly saying, no, this is not a one-way street. We're very happy for you to do that, because we're going to do it in your EEZ. Right? See, the Chinese are, just like they have the interesting theory with regard to the cow's tongue in the Territorial Sea, this is an area that they're really trying to develop the law, because it's a relatively new area of law. It's post-World War II. And they would say, well, the United States isn't even you may be a signatory, but you haven't ratified the UN Convention of Law of the Sea anyways. So what are you relying on, Article whatever? Well, the U.S. response is, well, that's right. There are a lot of things in the Convention of Law of the Sea that we don't regard as customary international law, but this one is. The customary practice of states have gotten to the point that whether you signed on to it or not, it's still the international law. It's the same thing with regard to like the Geneva Conventions, right? These things are so they're so obviously regarded as part of the international law. If a state were to say, well, we basically are not going to, we're going to reverse our being bound by the Geneva Convention. It doesn't matter. It's customary international law at this point, right? So to the degree that there's an international law of the EEZ, the U.S. would say, well, it includes high seas freedoms, not just military operations in the EEZ, but laying what they call submarine cables, which means internet cables, any one of a number of things, just as long as it doesn't mess around with the economic interests enjoyed by the coastal state. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know of, other than the Canadian example, I don't know of any real good reason to conduct them against the United States because of our particular approach to it. Now, I mentioned when the UNCLOS was getting drafted and how I wish there was some language in there where it said really clearly, and this includes military operations. At several of the meetings prior to the promulgation of the convention, in addition to China, countries like Chile and a few other ones were actually trying to say, we like the concept of the EEZ, but we don't like foreign militaries acting within our EEZ. And it was viewed as it wasn't that the foreign militaries were going to interfere with the fisheries, but it was just an idea we didn't like it. So to be fair to China, they weren't alone in this. There was definitely a minority of countries who said, as long as we're talking about the concept of EEZ, why don't we make this part of it? But maritime states like the United States and Britain and a lot of other ones that had sizable navies would say, well, no, we don't want that we don't want to have all the carve-outs for the EEZ because their high seas freedoms pertain there, and military activities are always part of high seas freedoms. They always have been, right? So, there is a list of about 5, 6, 7 states that have proposed or purport to say no military activities in our EEZ. The Chinese happen to be the ones who are most dogged about the point, and we've had these incidents, and they can get potentially dangerous with regard to maneuvering safely and damage to vessels, and then also, quite frankly, it doesn't sit well if we're in a place where the Chinese say it's their territorial waters anyways, and they're saying no military activities in our EEZ. I thought this was your territorial waters. Well, we'll come back to that later, right? Because it's all, all the South China Sea is within that cow's tongue, and the arbitration was no. That's not your territorial sea. The territorial sea in that context would swallow up 7 or 8 nations' EEZs. Yes, sir.
2 things for you. First, what's your take on the Law of the Sea Treaty? Is it truly in the best interest of the United States? Yeah. And second, the Soviets planted a flag on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean and laid claim to that area.
Yeah, the Lomonosov Ridge.
What's your take on that?
Yeah.
That's all I have.
Yeah. Well, I think the Navy, I think the Navy has come out and said they're in favor of us ratification of the UNCLOS, so it doesn't, I know the original American problem with the Law of the Sea Treaty, which had to do like minerals held under the, that would come up, that would be held in common with respect to any kind of mineral resources that would be on the seabed in the high seas, not within someone's EEZ, would be kind of like held in commonality or whatever. And the U.S. and some other nations had difficulty with that, and I think that got resolved. Again, I think there have been a lot of people who said, why don't we just go ahead and ratify it? And I think the Navy is actually was kind of, they had some in testimony, at least before Congress, there were some senior Navy leadership said that they thought they should do it. With regard to the Russians, I'm sorry.
There are globalist officers,
I know, yeah. There are. And then with respect to the Russian, that has to do with extended continental shelf, and it's but yeah, the U.S. hasn't recognized that claim at all with respect to their Arctic claims, whether it's extensive EEZ, extended continental shelf, or any kind of borders. That was those are viewed as being excessive maritime claims or subsea claims.
Well, this concept of American concept of the freedom of the sea, the problem is a dialogue of the deaf, because for a lot of nations it's just an act of imperialism, that they have an immense navy and it just violates our sovereignty. But a comment about the future in this century, about American naval power, because how long the U.S. Navy will be able to maintain global dominance when I think military technology, I'm not sure if it's going to favor the U.S. Navy. A lot of nations are going to acquire missiles that can, hit a carrier from thousands of miles. They don't need a fleet. Or for example, cyber technology can insert a virus to a warship. And since they depend on computer for radar communication, weapon system, and that's it. It's just a useless piece of metal in the water. And I'm afraid that at one point of this century, the U.S. Navy might face something like a battle midway in reverse or Spanish Armada moment. And I don't think the U.S. Navy or the U.S. government now they should kind of lower like the objectives to more realistic situation, and because I'm not sure how long they can hold this global dominance like that without being challenged.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly the challenge wouldn't come, as you suggest, from an equivalent force trying to, put out the equivalent size forces. I mean, it's going to be challenged because, for instance, the anti-ship missiles, right? That's a grave concern about, and the Chinese, by the way, have kind of are trailblazers when it comes to anti-ship missiles that could maybe take down something the size of a Nimitz class or a Ford class carrier. I mean, these are, extremely expensive ships, and although the missiles are not negligible, they are not anything like the cost of a ship. With regard to the personnel to man the ships, I mean, there is, one can see there has been a lot of work on, maybe not sailorless naval vessels, but ones that have, they're not quite drones, but the idea is you can deploy a force, a frigate-sized ship, for instance, and have a fraction of the current size crew on it, right? So the technology, certainly you could have the cyber technology that can work against any kind of military force, like a Navy, or you could use the technology. The question is, I mean, what happens if the force is not projected at sea? With regard to, and this is with respect to the second portion of the talk, when the U.S. is doing, for instance, freedom of navigation operations, it's going to be viewed as being in the vital national interest of the United States, but it's also other maritime states as well that are going to view it. So with regard to the topic global engagement, there is a fair amount of global benefit that the Navy is projecting the power it has. Now, some won't agree with that, or there would definitely be a different security situation if the U.S. Navy wasn't out as much as it is. But there are definitely going to be technological challenges, whether it's from missile technology, cyber technology, and I mean, it's a great debate that comes up every time the United States tries to order one of the big Nimitz class or now Ford class carriers. And people in Congress will say, isn't this thing a big sitting duck? A $15 billion sitting duck. I mean, that's why they go out with a submarine, 2 guided missile cruisers, maybe some destroyers or some frigates. They're there to protect it. And that's one of the reasons why the submarine threat is a very significant one. And sometimes you'll have, if a carrier battle group is out and then suddenly, a Chinese submarine were to pop up somewhere within the operational area, that's a big message. It says, this submarine just popped up. It could have actually, instead of just popping up here, it could have sent a torpedo into that very expensive asset. So, yeah, I mean, I think that with an expensive a force as the Navy, they have to constantly be vigilant about what is still worth the cost and what works and what doesn't work and what might be a sitting duck. I mean, we saw that with like the battleships in World War II, right? It was still the battleship mentality, but it was in the process of shifting over to the carriers. But are we still in a battleship mentality just about the carriers, but maybe that's not where we should be facing. We should have, there was the idea of the littoral combat ships. I mean, I've been in long enough. I've been in for about 25, 26 years. You hear these different renditions of like, oh no, we need to be a brown water navy. We need to be off the coast. The littoral combat ship. We're going to be fighting non-state actors. We shouldn't be worried about projecting American power in the sea lanes so much. And then it seems like if you wait, 10 years, you start to hear different. Things that maybe slide back to. We got to make sure the Strait of Malacca stays open, and you can't do that with a littoral combat ship. But
Question over here.
Yeah, this isn't a naval question, but I was wondering if you
Speak into the microphone, please.
if you were aware of the current situation with the case in Guantanamo, where the defendant lawyers refused to defend their clients because they didn't feel that they were qualified.
are you talking about detailed military defense counsel? I'm afraid I don't know about the case.
Okay.
Yeah. It would be, the reason I asked if they were detailed military counsel is because if they were civilian counsel, presumably, there have been a lot of, like...
No, it was a military because
Okay.
They didn't think they didn't have any experience defending the death penalty.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah, that is being death penalty qualified is, whether it's a case, a military commission that potentially involves the death penalty or even a civilian case. Yeah, you should, just my view, if you're going to be in a death penalty case, you should be death penalty case certified. That's yes, sir.
As a military attorney, do you have an opinion on the potential CIA nominee possibly being linked to torture, whether it was authorized or not by whoever? Do you have an opinion on how that should go forward?
No, I don't. I read the same things in there. I read the things that came out within 24 hours and the things that came out 48 hours that said there wasn't a basis in it. My own view is that the UCMJ, Uniform Court of Military Justice, always has, assault, abuse of a detainee, whatever. These are offenses under the UCMJ. So, military members, it's illegal for them to be involved in anything involving abuse of a prisoner, and it doesn't have to be a prisoner or it could be a detainee. My understanding is that the Army, with regard to interrogations, the Army Field Manual is the one that is what is authorized. We're in a different scenario in that there's not a lot of, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, ISIS prisoners getting taken, but to the degree that there's interrogations, the Army Field Manual, with regard to military personnel, is what's controlling. I didn't actually, I think this person was like deputy director of the CIA. I never even heard of the person, so I'm afraid I don't know anything about her background or whether those are true complaints or not.
Should we be taking the higher ground in situations like this? Yes, I understand the reaction to 9/11 and all the rest of it, but John McCain coming out of, the Illinois prison situation and so forth says we shouldn't be doing any sort of torture.
That would be my view, and that the UCMJ should be enforced entirely if the military is involved, and if the military is not involved, there is still Common Article 3 to the Geneva Conventions, which is about if you have in a non-international armed conflict, you're taking, for instance, non-state actors, and I think the Supreme Court has said that Common Article 3 is applicable, which means you actually couldn't subject detainees or prisoners to any kind of treatment like that.
this on? A couple years ago, there was an incident off of Iran where an American Navy vessel strayed into Iranian waters, captured by the Iranian Republican Guard.
Yeah.
My friends have fishing boats, and they have GPSs on them, and they work really well.
Yeah.
I'm kind of wondering, how is GPS impacted? Because I find that a little bit curious that a Navy vessel would accidentally stray into an area which, with that kind of technology. Can you speak to how that technology is in any way changing?
Yeah, I know about the incident, and I had the same questions, like what, why, I mean, there wasn't anything about that incident that I didn't find troubling, including how did they get there, and then the reaction, yeah, I don't, and if it wasn't a GPS problem, I mean, if it was,
I have a speedometer, and I can tell the officer, well,
right.
he'd say, weren't you watching it?
Right. Yeah, and of course it gets even more outrageous if they weren't in Iranian territorial waters.
So what I'm asking is, has GPS as a technology affected any of this in terms of those kinds of decisions?
Well, I mean, GPS is very important, but and obviously, but people are actually, the people in the military are starting to think we're over-relying on GPS because it's because of the cyber vulnerabilities, for instance, and where it's all coming from. I mean, I'm old enough to remember I was out on an ammunition ship once watching the quartermaster use a sextant to figure out where we were, and it was great. It's the old-fashioned way. And then fast forward, I was on the bridge of a very expensive aircraft carrier, and there was this little thing that says, "Oh, this is where we are." Like, I hope it's right, because we were off of Mexico, and there's a big rock out there. I don't know who it belongs to, but there's 12 miles of territorial sea around it, but that won't stop an aircraft carrier. So, yeah, I think there's a tremendous, speaking of cyber vulnerabilities, and the GPS is a vulnerability. Yes, ma'am.
Question up front.
Oh, yeah.
This is probably an odd question, but I was thinking when you define rock and island and country, and I thought about the country like the Seychelles that are going underwater. If they were a country and they were an island, but then eventually they're underwater, what would they be then?
Yeah, I don't. I don't know the answer to the question. I guess there would be. I mean, there's a historic. If I were to venture a guess, I mean, there is a thing under international law where you can have, for instance, there could be the idea of the historic bay or whatever. This is why back in, if you remember back in the 80s, remember the line of death, the Gulf of Sidra off of Libya? So this was a line that the Libyan government, headed by Muammar Gaddafi at the time, says, okay, this whole Gulf of Sidra, it's actually Territorial Sea of Libya in here, and it's a historic bay, right? And the U.S. and actually no other maritime nation that I know of said, no, it's not a historic bay, it never was, and we can sail in there, right? Well, Seychelles would have a claim, I think, saying, no, these are the historic boundaries of Seychelles based on, this rock is now a high tide elevation. So I would say that would be my argument to the Seychelles, is you argue the history of it, because the history, one of the fascinating things about international law is the role that history plays. And in the development of customary international law, there could be something that, well, up here off of the Grand Banks, this has always been how it's done in this area, so there could be a special aspect or application of international law there where it's going to be an exception to the norm, right? So with regard to, for instance, the EEZ and military operations, you wouldn't want to say, I understand you maritime nations, you want to have military operations in the EEZ, and generally you're right, except no one's ever challenged the Chinese claims. And so basically it's been going on long enough that maybe there's no military operations in the Chinese EEZ, but these other ones maybe there are, right? There can be exceptions under customary international law. because it's based on the custom and practice of states, right? So if the practice of states goes on long enough, it can actually be kind of like an easement on a property. You want to make sure that the challenge is open and notorious. That would be my take on the Seychelles question anyways.
Just a quick announcement, because we've run out of time. If you are heading north, they seem to have closed down 8th Street on the bridge for maintenance. So head over to 10th and use it as a two-way street. I think just to the right, probably not to the left. So that is it for this evening. Thank you very much. Big round of applause for Professor Kelly. Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.